At 9:40 on the evening of February 15, 1898, Captain Charles Sigsbee sat in his cabin aboard the Battleship Maine, writing a letter to his wife. The Havana harbor was quiet. A warm tropical breeze drifted through the open porthole. Most of the crew had turned in for the night after the bugler sounded taps at 9:10. The Maine had been anchored at buoy number 4 for 3 weeks now, watching over American interests during Cuba's violent struggle for independence from Spain. Sigsbee was 53 years old, born in Albany, New York, a distinguished naval officer who had spent decades mapping the ocean floor and inventing deep-sea sounding equipment. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1863 and fought in the Civil War, participating in the assault on Fort Fisher. After the war, he had made his name in hydrography, commanding the Coast Survey steamer Blake and discovering the deepest point in the Gulf of Mexico, a place that would later bear his name, the Sigsbee Deep. He was a scientist as much as a warrior, a man who believed in precision and careful measurement. He had commanded the Maine since April of 1897, less than a year. In that time, he had grown to know his ship intimately. He knew the sound of her twin vertical triple expansion steam engines, the rhythm of her anchor chain, the creak of her 6,682-ton steel hull. He knew every compartment, every passageway, every gun emplacement. He also knew something was wrong with her design, something that worried him every single day. The Maine carried over 5 tons of gunpowder in her forward magazines. Her 6-inch guns required constant supplies of ammunition, stored in reserve magazines throughout the ship. The largest of these magazines sat directly adjacent to coal bunker 16, which stored the bituminous coal that fed her 8 Scottish coal-fired boilers. Between the explosives and the coal was a single steel bulkhead, just 1/4 of an inch thick. That thin wall was all that separated 11,000 pounds of powder from fuel that was known to spontaneously combust. Sigsbee finished a sentence in his letter. He paused, thinking about what to write next. The harbor was unusually still. The Spanish cruiser Alfonso XII floated nearby. Lights from Havana's waterfront glittered across the dark water. Then the world ended. At 9:40 exactly, a massive explosion tore through the forward section of the Maine. The blast lifted the bow of the ship out of the water. Passengers on the nearby Wardline steamer City of Washington saw the bow rise as if pushed by a giant hand. A tremendous roar echoed across the harbor. A second explosion followed almost immediately, this one even more devastating as the forward magazines detonated. More than 5 tons of powder charges ignited at once, obliterating the forward third of the ship. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows across Havana. People blocks away felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Sigmund Rothschild, a passenger on the City of Washington, was on deck facing the warship when the explosion occurred. He later described seeing the bow of the Maine rise slightly out of the water, then a flash of fire, then an enormous explosion that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. For a moment, the entire ship seemed to be engulfed in flame. Then the bow simply ceased to exist. Sigsbee felt his cabin lurch violently. The lights went out. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a deep thundering roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cabin filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning. Debris rained down on the deck above him. He could hear men screaming. The ship was already listing hard to port, taking on water at a catastrophic rate. Sigsbee grabbed his cap and made his way topside through smoke-filled passageways. The corridors were dark, lit only by the flames. From the forward section, other officers were emerging from their cabins, stunned and confused. Lieutenant Commander Richard Wainwright was already on deck, trying to assess the damage. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The entire forward section of the ship was gone. Where the bow had been, there was now only twisted steel and fire. The explosion had lifted portions of the keel and bottom plating, bending them upward and outward in a grotesque inverted 5 shape. Flames shot from ruptured fuel lines and ignited ammunition continued to cook off, sending traces of fire into the night sky. Men were in the water, struggling among the wreckage. Some were crying for help, others were silent, floating face down amid the debris and the slick of oil spreading across the harbor. Lieutenant John Hood and Naval Cadet David Boyd attempted to reach the forward section to assess damage and rescue survivors. They found the front of the ship was nothing but a mass of what appeared to be burning cellulose. There was no one to rescue. Anyone in the forward third of the main when the explosion occurred had died instantly. Of the 355 men aboard the main that night, 261 would die. Most of them had been sleeping in the enlisted quarters in the forward part of the ship when the explosion occurred. They never had a chance. They never heard the warning. They simply ceased to exist in a fraction of a second, their lives ended by a disaster they could not have anticipated and could not have escaped. To understand what happened that night and why it changed the course of American history, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the design decisions that made the Maine a floating time bomb and the warnings that everyone ignored. The Maine was authorized by Congress on August 3, 1886, in an era when the United States Navy was finally emerging from decades of neglect. After the Civil War, the Great Fleet of ironclads and monitors had been allowed to rot at anchor. By the 1880s, the American Navy ranked behind the fleets of countries like Chile and Brazil. The Maine and her near sister ship Texas were meant to change that, to prove that the United States could build modern warships to rival the great European navies. Her keel was laid at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on October 17, 1888. She would take 9 years to complete, an extraordinarily long construction period that reflected the limits of American industry at the time. The delivery of her armored plating alone took 3 years. A fire in the drafting room where her blueprints were stored caused further delays. American shipyards were learning as they built, developing techniques and skills that had long been mastered in Britain and France. The ship was 324 feet long overall, with a beam of 57 feet and a maximum draft of 22 feet 6 inches. Her displacement was 6,682 long tons. She was divided into 214 watertight compartments, with a centerline longitudinal bulkhead separating her twin engines. A double bottom covered the hull from the foremast to the aft end of the armoured citadel, a distance of 196 feet. Her main armament consisted of 4 10-inch 30-caliber guns mounted in 2 twin turrets. These turrets were positioned en echelon, offset from the centerline on opposite sides of the ship, an arrangement that allowed both turrets to fire ahead, astern, or across the deck. It was an innovative design borrowed from the British ironclad inflexible and similar Italian warships, but it would prove problematic. The offset turrets created balance issues and limited the ability to fire a true broadside. Secondary armament included 6 6-inch 30-caliber guns, 7 6-pounder guns, 8 1-pounder guns, and 4 Gatling guns for close defense. She also carried 4 18-inch torpedo tubes mounted above the waterline. Her armor scheme employed Harvey process steel, an advancement over earlier compound armor that provided superior hardness through surface carburization. The main belt measured 12 inches thick amidships, tapering to 8 inches below the waterline, over a 180-foot length, protecting the machinery spaces and magazines. On paper, she was an impressive fighting machine. She could make 16.5 knots on trials, powered by twin vertical triple expansion steam engines, producing 9,000 indicated horsepower. Her nickel steel armor could withstand the fire of contemporary cruisers. Her 10-inch guns could damage any ship afloat. But the Maine had a critical flaw built into her from the very beginning, a flaw that naval architects understood, but somehow accepted. Her designers had placed the coal bunkers directly adjacent to the forward ammunition magazines. This was not unusual for warships of the era. Coal bunkers along the hull could provide additional protection against enemy shells absorbing impacts that might otherwise penetrate to vital spaces, but it created a dangerous situation that engineers were only beginning to understand fully. Bituminous coal, the type used aboard the Maine and increasingly preferred by the Navy for its higher heat output and faster steaming speeds, was known to be volatile. When freshly broken, the exposed surfaces could absorb moisture from the air. This triggered an exothermic reaction that generated heat. If the coal was not properly ventilated, the heat could build until the coal spontaneously ignited. The process could take days or weeks, the coal slowly smouldering inside the bunker, invisible to casual inspection. Coal bunker fires were a common problem on warships of this period. Between 1894 and 1908, more than 20 such fires were documented aboard United States Navy vessels. The armored cruiser New York, an 82-100-ton vessel, suffered from spontaneous coal fires. The battleship Oregon, on her famous voyage around South America during the Spanish-American War, dealt with 4 coal bunkers ablaze simultaneously at one point during her journey. The mains bunker A-16 sat immediately adjacent to the reserve magazine for her 6-inch guns. This magazine held over 11,000 pounds of powder. Between the coal and the explosives was that single 1/4-inch steel bulkhead, a 1/4 inch, about the thickness of 3 stacked coins. If a fire started in the coal bunker and was not detected, the heat could eventually transfer through that thin wall. Coal fires could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The ignition point for the black powder used in the mains ammunition was considerably lower. The bunkers were supposed to be inspected regularly. Temperature readings were supposed to be taken. Ventilation was supposed to be maintained. But the mains bunkers had not been checked for nearly 12 hours before the explosion. It was night time. Most of the crew was asleep. The coal sat in its bunker, doing whatever coal does in the dark, while the men who might have noticed something wrong slept in their hammocks just feet away. Some naval officers understood this danger. They had seen coal bunker fires before. They knew how quickly the temperature could rise, how easy it was for a fire to go undetected in a sealed bunker, how catastrophic the consequences could be if that fire reached ammunition. Technical journals of the era discussed the problem. Engineers proposed solutions: better ventilation, more frequent inspections, relocating magazines away from coal storage. But the main was built anyway, her magazine sitting beside her coal like a bomb waiting for a spark. It was a design decision made in 1886 that could not be undone. By the time the ship was commissioned in 1895, naval architecture had advanced. Enough to recognize the flaw, but the main was what she was. The coal bunkers stayed where they were. The magazines stayed where they were. The 1/4-inch bulkhead stayed where it was. The main was commissioned on September 17, 1895, under the command of Captain Arent Crowninshield. She spent her first years operating along the east coast of the United States and in the Caribbean. Her duties were largely routine, training cruises and port visits. But by 1897, the situation in Cuba was deteriorating rapidly. Cuban revolutionaries had been fighting for independence from Spain since 1895. The Spanish response was brutal. General Valeriano Weyler implemented a policy of reconcentration, forcing Cuban civilians into fortified camps to deny the rebels support. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans died from disease and starvation in these camps. American newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, published sensational accounts of Spanish atrocities. The reports inflamed public opinion and created pressure on President William McKinley to intervene. In January of 1898, riots broke out in Havana. American Consul General Fitzhugh Lee, the nephew of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, grew concerned about the safety of American citizens and property on the island. He sent word to Washington that a show of naval force might help stabilize the situation. On January 24, 1898, the Maine departed Key West, Florida, for Havana. Captain Sigsbee slowed his approach to the harbor, wanting to make a dignified entrance. He had his crew in their dress uniforms and all flags flying. He also had men hidden in the gun turrets, ready for any danger. The Maine arrived at Havana Harbor at 11 in the morning on January 25 and was guided to buoy number 4 by a Spanish pilot. The Spanish authorities were not pleased to see an American warship in their harbor. The visit had been arranged with only a few hours' notice, but they observed the diplomatic courtesies. Spanish officers paid formal calls on Sigsbee. The governor of Havana sent his regards. On the surface, everything was proper and polite. Beneath the surface, tension was mounting. Sigsbee kept his crew confined to the ship, not wanting to risk incidents on shore. He maintained strict security protocols, limiting visitors and keeping watchful eyes on the water around his vessel. The Maine sat at anchor, waiting. For 3 weeks the Maine remained in Havana Harbor, Sigsbee wrote regular reports to Washington describing the situation as calm but uncertain. He recommended that another warship relieve the Maine, keeping a continuous American naval presence in Cuba. The ship was scheduled to depart for New Orleans on February 15 to participate in Mardi Gras celebrations. Instead, she would meet a very different fate. The night of February 15 was hot and humid. The harbour was quiet. Most of the Maine's crew had retired to their quarters after taps. The enlisted men slept in the forward part of the ship, packed into hammocks in the spaces between the magazines and the hull. The officers were quartered aft, in more comfortable accommodations away from the machinery and armaments. Sigsbee was in his cabin, writing to his wife. Lieutenant John Blandin had the watch on deck. He later recalled that everything seemed normal as he made his rounds. Some of the crew were singing on deck. The night was dark, overcast, and threatening rain. It was quiet, he said. So quiet for that harbour. At 9:40, the explosion came. Witnesses on shore described seeing the bow of the Maine rise out of the water. A tremendous blast lit up the harbour. Then a second, even larger explosion sent a column of fire and debris into the night sky. Windows shattered across Havana. People ran into the streets thinking there had been an earthquake. The Spanish responded immediately and heroically. Boats from the Alfonso XII and other Spanish vessels raced to the scene to rescue survivors. Captain Sigsbee later praised the Spanish Navy for their assistance, noting that many American sailors owed their lives to the prompt rescue efforts. Spanish military and medical personnel worked alongside Americans to pull men from the water and treat the wounded. The famous nurse Clara Barton happened to be in Havana at the time, coordinating relief efforts for Cuban civilians. She immediately assisted with caring for the injured sailors. The wounded were taken to hospitals in Havana and later to Key West. Those who died in the hospitals were buried in Key West. The bodies recovered from the harbour were buried with full honours in Havana's Colon Cemetery, with thousands of Cuban and Spanish citizens lining the streets for the funeral procession. Of the 94 survivors, only 16 were uninjured. Many suffered terrible burns, broken bones, and internal injuries from the blast. Some would die in the days and weeks that followed from their wounds. The dead included 2 officers, Lieutenant Friend Jenkins and Assistant Engineer Darwin Merritt, and 259 enlisted men and Marines. The crew had been remarkably diverse for its era, drawn from 23 states and 15 countries. 22 African-American sailors served aboard the Maine. At that time, there was no segregation in the enlisted ranks of the Navy, not because the Navy was progressive, but because life at sea was so hard that mixing with black sailors did not offend the sensibilities of white officers who rarely interacted with enlisted men anyway. Nearly all of the African-American crew members died in the explosion, their quarters in the forward part of the ship. 7 Japanese nationals perished in the disaster. These men, mostly mess attendants and cooks, had enlisted in the Navy at ports along the American coast. One survivor, Fusanoin Awo, had enlisted in New York in 1897 and was serving as a steerage cook. Among his possessions lost in the explosion was a Japanese English dictionary and books on grammar and geography, evidence of a young man working to master a new language in a new land. After surviving the Maine, Awo would serve on 7 more ships and consistently receive excellent ratings before leaving the Navy in 1901. Sailors from Canada, Great Britain, Russia, China, and the Philippines also served aboard the Maine. The ship was a floating cross-section of the immigrant communities that fed the American military in an era before stricter citizenship requirements. These men had come to America for opportunity, had enlisted in the Navy for steady pay and meals, and had died in a harbour thousands of miles from their birthplaces. The explosion happened in the forward section of the ship, exactly where the coal bunkers sat adjacent to the ammunition magazines. This was not a coincidence. The destruction was concentrated precisely where the design flaw existed, where fire could have transferred from smouldering coal through a thin steel wall into tons of waiting gunpowder. Captain Sigsbee, shaken but composed, sent a telegram to Secretary of the Navy John Long. "Maine blown up in Havana Harbour at 9:40 tonight and destroyed," he wrote. "Many wounded and doubtless more killed or drowned." Then he added a remarkable sentence. "Public opinion should be suspended until further report." It was wise counsel. It was also completely ignored. Within hours of the explosion, American newspapers were printing headlines that blamed Spain. The New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, declared destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. The paper offered a $50,000 reward for information about the perpetrators, implying that there were perpetrators to be found. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World ran the headline, "Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo." Neither paper had any evidence for these claims. Neither paper cared. They were in the business of selling newspapers, and nothing sold newspapers like war. The term yellow journalism had been coined to describe the sensational, often fabricated reporting practiced by Hearst and Pulitzer. The name came from a popular comic strip character called the Yellow Kid that had run in both papers. The two publishers had been locked in a bitter circulation war for years, each trying to outdo the other with more spectacular headlines, more lurid stories, more dramatic illustrations. They had discovered that tales of Spanish brutality in Cuba sold particularly well. For years before the Maine explosion, Hearst and Pulitzer had been publishing inflammatory stories about Spanish atrocities. Some were true. General Weyler's reconcentration camps were genuinely horrific, and hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians had died. But the newspapers exaggerated and embellished freely. Stories were illustrated with drawings that depicted events the artists had never witnessed. Headlines declared as fact things that were merely rumor. When the famous artist Frederick Remington, sent by Hearst to Cuba to provide illustrations, reportedly cabled that there was no war to cover, Hearst allegedly replied, "You furnish the pictures, I will provide the war." Whether this exchange actually occurred is disputed, but it captured the spirit of the era perfectly. The sinking of the Maine was the story they had been waiting for. Within days of the explosion, before any investigation had even begun, the newspapers had convicted Spain in the court of public opinion. The New York Journal published detailed diagrams purporting to show how Spanish agents had planted a mine beneath the Maine. The diagrams were entirely fictional. The paper had no evidence whatsoever for its claims, but the images were compelling and readers believed what they saw. Remember, the Maine became a rallying cry. "To hell with Spain" became a slogan. Public opinion, far from being suspended, was being whipped into a frenzy by men who cared nothing for the truth and everything for their circulation numbers. The American people wanted someone to blame, and the newspapers gave them a target. The dead sailors became props in a propaganda campaign, their sacrifice exploited by publishers who had never met them and did not particularly care about their fate. President McKinley ordered a naval court of inquiry to investigate the explosion. The court, headed by Captain William Sampson, a respected officer who would later command the American fleet in Caribbean operations, convened on February 20 aboard the lighthouse tender Mangrove in Havana Harbor. Divers examined the wreckage in murky water, feeling their way through the twisted metal with their hands since visibility was nearly zero. Survivors testified about what they had seen and heard. The court looked for evidence of what had caused the destruction. The conditions for the investigation were far from ideal. The wreck lay in about 40 feet of water, with much of the evidence obscured by mud and debris. The divers could only examine limited portions of the hull, and what they found was often confusing. The forward section of the ship was so thoroughly destroyed that determining the sequence of events proved nearly impossible. The technology to conduct a thorough underwater forensic investigation simply did not exist in 1898. There were no underwater cameras, no sonar mapping, no forensic metallurgy to analyze the pattern of metal deformation. The court heard testimony from Captain Sigsbee, who described his actions on the night of the explosion and his impressions of what had occurred. Lieutenant Commander Wainwright testified about his attempts to reach the forward section of the ship after the blast. Survivors described hearing two distinct explosions, the first like a gunshot, the second like a thunderclap. This testimony would later prove significant, as it suggested that an initial smaller explosion had triggered the catastrophic detonation of the main magazines. The court also summoned Commander George Converse from the torpedo station at Newport, Rhode Island, to provide technical expertise. Captain Sampson posed a hypothetical situation to Converse, asking whether a coal bunker fire could ignite ammunition in an adjacent magazine and cause the kind of destruction observed on the Maine. Converse acknowledged that such a scenario was possible, But this line of inquiry was not pursued further. The court was not looking for an internal explanation. The political pressure for an external cause for Spanish culpability was immense. On March 28, after 5 weeks of investigation, the court released its findings. They concluded that the Maine had been destroyed by an external explosion, likely from a submarine mine, which had then detonated the forward magazines. The evidence they cited was the pattern of damage to the keel and bottom plating, which appeared to show upward buckling consistent with a blast from below the ship. The court carefully stated that they were unable to obtain evidence fixing the responsibility for the destruction upon any person or persons. They did not blame Spain directly, but the implication was clear enough for most Americans. The Spanish conducted their own investigation. Their naval officers examined the wreckage and interviewed witnesses. They reached a very different conclusion. The Spanish investigators noted that there had been no visible water geyser at the time of the explosion, no dead fish with ruptured bladders floating on the surface afterward, phenomena that would typically accompany an underwater mine blast. They concluded that the explosion had been internal, probably caused by spontaneous combustion of coal. Few Americans paid attention to the Spanish findings. The war drums were already beating. On April 11, 1898, President McKinley asked Congress for authorization to use military force in Cuba. On April 20th, Congress passed a joint resolution demanding that Spain withdraw from the island and authorizing the President to use whatever means necessary to achieve Cuban independence. The Teller Amendment, attached to this resolution, promised that the United States would not annex Cuba, a conscience-clearing measure that allowed Americans to frame the coming war as a fight for liberation rather than conquest. Spain severed diplomatic relations with the United States on April 21st. The same day, the United States Navy began a blockade of Cuba. On April 25, Congress declared that a state of war had existed since April 21. The Spanish-American War had begun. The war was pathetically one-sided. Spain had not prepared for a conflict with the United States. Their navy was outdated, their army scattered across distant colonies, their treasury exhausted by years of colonial warfare. The American military, while not large, was modernizing rapidly and eager to prove itself on the world stage. Young men who had grown up hearing stories of Civil War glory now wanted a war of their own. Theodore Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had been agitating for war for months. He saw conflict with Spain as both a moral imperative and a chance for national rejuvenation. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey led the American Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay in the Philippines. The Spanish Pacific Fleet, under Admiral Patricio Montojo, was anchored there, outgunned and outmatched. In a matter of hours, Dewey destroyed the entire Spanish squadron. The battle was so one-sided that Dewey reportedly ordered his men to take a second breakfast in the middle of the engagement, so confident was he of victory. Fewer than 10 American sailors were killed. Spanish casualties exceeded 370. When word of the victory reached the United States, Dewey became an instant national hero. In Cuba, American forces landed in June near the city of Santiago. The campaign that followed would produce some of the most famous images of American military history. The charge up San Juan Hill and neighboring Kettle Hill, led by Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders alongside regular army units including the African-American 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, captured the heights overlooking the city. Roosevelt, who had resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to lead the Volunteer Regiment, would parlay his wartime fame into the presidency just 3 years later. On July 3rd, the Spanish Caribbean Squadron under Admiral Pascual Cervera attempted to escape Santiago Harbor and was destroyed by the waiting American fleet. Every Spanish ship was sunk or run aground. Over 300 Spanish sailors died and nearly 1,700 were captured. American losses were 1 killed and 1 wounded. On July 17th, Santiago surrendered. On July 25th, American troops landed in Puerto Rico and advanced with virtually no opposition. On August 13th, Manila fell to American forces, though the battle was somewhat theatrical, as the Spanish had already agreed to surrender and staged a brief defense to satisfy their honor before capitulating. The entire war lasted less than 4 months. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. For Spain, it was a catastrophe. For the United States, it was a coming-out party. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba was granted independence, though it would remain under American influence for decades. The United States paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines, a sum that did little to ease Spanish humiliation. The treaty marked the end of the Spanish Empire and the emergence of the United States as a world power. All because of an explosion that killed 261 sailors on a quiet night in Havana Harbor. But what really caused that explosion? The question would not go away. The wreck of the Maine lay at the bottom of Havana Harbor for years, a twisted monument to the dead. By 1910, pressure was mounting to do something about it. The wreck occupied valuable anchorage space and was creating a navigational hazard as silt built up around the hull. Various patriotic groups wanted memorials from the ship, and there were still an estimated 70 bodies trapped inside. On May 9, 1910, Congress authorized funds to remove the wreck and recover the remains. The Army Corps of Engineers was given the task. What they attempted had never been done before. They would build a cofferdam around the entire wreck, pump out the water, and expose the ship for examination. The cofferdam was an engineering marvel. 20 massive cylinders, each 50 feet in diameter, were formed from interlocking steel sheet piles driven through 37 feet of seawater and 20 feet of mud and clay. The cylinders were then filled with more clay and mud to create a watertight barrier. It took months of difficult work, battling hurricanes, equipment failures, and the constant pressure of the sea. By mid-1911, the cofferdam was complete and the water was being pumped out. Slowly, the Maine emerged from her watery grave. The sight was shocking. The forward third of the ship was completely destroyed, nothing but twisted metal bearing no resemblance to a bow. The rest of the wreck was severely corroded after 13 years underwater. A second Naval Board of Inquiry was convened to examine the exposed wreckage. They studied the bent and torn plates, photographed everything, and took careful measurements. Their conclusion echoed the 1898 finding. The Maine had been destroyed by an external explosion, they said, though they placed the blast site slightly further aft than the original investigators. The remains of 66 men were found during the salvage operation. Only one, a crew member named Harry Keyes, could be positively identified. The bones and partial remains were reverently collected and prepared for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. On March 16, 1912, the after section of the Maine was refloated and towed out of Havana Harbor. An American flag flew from a jury-rigged mast. Flowers covered the deck. Over 100,000 people lined the shores of Havana to watch. The stern section was towed 4 miles offshore, and, with full military honors, her seacocks were opened. The Maine settled beneath the waves for the final time, coming to rest in 600 fathoms of water as taps sounded and guns fired a 21-gun salute. But the question remained: mine or coal fire, external explosion or internal accident? In 1974, Admiral Hyman Rickover, the legendary father of the nuclear navy, became intrigued by the Maine mystery. He assembled a team of experts to re-examine the evidence using modern forensic techniques and knowledge gained from analyzing ship explosions during World War II. Rickover's team studied the photographs from the 1911 salvage operation, the testimony from both investigations, the ship's construction records, and everything known about coal fires and magazine explosions. They applied knowledge that simply had not existed in 1898. Their conclusion, published in 1976 in a book titled How the Battleship Maine Was Destroyed, was unequivocal. The explosion had originated inside the ship. There was no mine. The most likely cause was a fire in coal bunker A-16 that transferred heat through the thin bulkhead and ignited the ammunition in the adjacent magazine. Rickover noted that the pattern of damage was consistent with an internal explosion, not an external one. An underwater mine would have produced different damage. Signatures, different bending of the plates. The photographs showed the bottom of the ship pushed downward and outward in places, not inward as would be expected from a mine. The coal bunker fire theory made sense. The Maine used bituminous coal, which was volatile and prone to spontaneous combustion. Her bunkers had not been inspected for nearly 12 hours before the explosion. A fire could have been smouldering undetected, building heat, until it reached the critical temperature to ignite the powder just inches away through that quarter-inch steel wall. In 1998, National Geographic commissioned another investigation using computer modeling techniques. Their results were mixed. The computer analysis showed that a coal bunker fire could have generated sufficient heat to detonate the magazines, but it also showed that a small handmade mine could have penetrated the hull and caused similar damage. The debate continued. Today, most historians accept the coal fire theory as the most likely explanation. No evidence of Spanish involvement has ever been found. Spain had every reason to avoid a war with the United States and nothing to gain from sinking the Maine. The technology for a covert mine attack in a busy harbour was questionable, and coal bunker fires were a known, documented problem that had caused concern aboard many ships. But absolute certainty remains elusive. The original wreck was destroyed during the salvage operation. The stern section lies in deep water, inaccessible to detailed examination. We may never know for certain what happened at 9:40 on the night of February 15, 1898. What we do know is that 261 men died. What we do know is that their deaths were used to justify a war. What we do know is that the sensational press of the day inflamed public opinion, without evidence, blaming Spain for an explosion that was almost certainly an accident. The Maine is sometimes called the forgotten casualty of yellow journalism. The men who died were victims not just of an explosion, but of a design flaw that placed coal beside ammunition, of inadequate safety procedures that allowed fires to go undetected, and ultimately of a media frenzy that transformed a tragedy into a pretext for war. Captain Sigsbee survived the explosion and the war. He was exonerated by the Court of Inquiry and went on to command other ships. He commanded the auxiliary cruiser St. Paul at the Second Battle of San Juan, captured enemy vessels, and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. He retired in 1907 and spent his remaining years dealing with correspondence about the Maine, questions about that night, requests for his memories. Sigsbee died on July 13, 1923, at the age of 78. He was buried with full military honours at Arlington National Cemetery, not far from the mast of the ship whose loss defined his life. His temperate, judicious dispatches from Havana had urged caution and patience. History did not listen. The main mast of the Maine stands today at Arlington National Cemetery, the centerpiece of the USS Maine Mast Memorial. Beneath it lie the remains of 163 crew members, many of them unidentified. Other memorials exist at Key West, where 19 additional crew members are buried, and in Havana itself, where the Cuban government erected a monument in 1926 to commemorate American assistance in securing Cuban independence. Parts of the Maine are scattered across America. Her foremast stands at the United States Naval Academy. A 6-inch gun sits in Fort Allen Park in Portland, Maine. Artifacts from the ship appear in museums and memorials from coast to coast. Pieces of a tragedy, reminders of men who died for reasons we may never fully understand. The phrase "remember the Maine" has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment, about the power of media to shape public opinion, about the ease with which tragedy can be exploited for political ends. The men who died in Havana Harbor deserved better than to become pawns in a propaganda campaign. John Henry Turpin was one of the African-American survivors of the Maine. 7 years later, in 1905, he would survive another naval disaster when the gunboat Bennington exploded in San Diego, killing 66 of his shipmates. Turpin had drawn a remarkably unlucky hand in the lottery of naval service, present for 2 of the worst peacetime disasters in American naval history, yet somehow surviving both. One survivor of the Maine, a Japanese national named Katsusaburo Kushida, was one of only 16 crew members to emerge from the disaster completely uninjured. How he escaped the inferno that killed nearly everyone in the forward section of the ship remains unknown. His service records offer no explanation. He simply walked away from an explosion that killed 261 of his shipmates. On the 125th anniversary of the sinking, In February of 2023, a ceremony was held at the Maine Memorial in Arlington. Speakers talked about courage and sacrifice. They talked about the importance of remembering those who served. They also talked about truth, about the need to understand what really happened before assigning blame. Rear Admiral Sam Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, noted that Captain Sigsbee's advice to suspend public opinion until the facts were known had been wise counsel then and remained wise counsel now. In October of 2000, the wreck of the Maine's stern section was rediscovered by an expedition company using advanced sonar equipment. The remains lie in about 3,770 feet of water, roughly 3 miles northeast of Havana Harbor. The wreck is protected by international maritime law and the agreements between the United States and Cuba. No plans exist to disturb it further. The Maine has found her final resting place. The investigation into the Maine took 5 weeks in 1898. The decision to go to war took less than 3 months. The consequences lasted for decades and shaped the world we live in today. The United States emerged as a colonial power with possessions stretching from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The Philippines endured years of brutal conflict as Filipino insurgents fought American occupation, a war that killed far more Americans than the splendid little war against Spain had done. Puerto Rico remains a territory to this day, its residents American citizens who cannot vote for president. Guam became a strategic military outpost that would prove crucial during World War II and remains so today. All of this flowed from an explosion that was almost certainly an accident, from a design flaw that put coal beside gunpowder, from newspapers that cared more about selling copies than telling truth, from a public eager for someone to blame and politicians unwilling to resist the tide. The crew of the Maine came from 23 states and 15 countries. They were young men mostly, sailors and Marines doing their duty far from home. Frank Talbot was 20 years old, from Bath, Maine, a bright boy who had worked in a local mill before enlisting. His last letter to his parents mentioned hoping to come home in the spring. Millard Harris was a quartermaster from Boothbay, Maine, an experienced sailor who had gone back to sea. William Lambert was an African-American fireman from Hampton, Virginia, described by a teammate as a master of speed, curves, and control on the baseball diamond. He had pitched the Maine to a Navy championship just weeks before the explosion. These men did not know about the coal bunkers and the thin bulkheads. They did not know about the fire risk that naval architects debated in technical journals. They did not read the newspapers that would soon use their deaths to sell copies and start a war. They simply served and slept and died. Remember the Maine, remember the men, remember to ask questions before accepting easy answers. Remember that the truth is usually more complicated than the headlines suggest. Remember that 261 sailors went to sleep on a quiet night in Havana Harbor and never woke up. That is the real story of the battleship that suddenly exploded, not a tale of Spanish treachery or American vengeance, but a story of flawed engineering, ignored warnings, inadequate safety procedures, and the terrible price paid by ordinary men for the failures of those who designed their ship and shaped their fate. It is a story that reminds us to be skeptical of those who offer simple explanations for complex events, to demand evidence before accepting accusations, and to remember that the rush to war often serves interests that have nothing to do with justice or truth. If you found this story as important as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.